When doubts and problems arise, God's love is opening a way. Believe. There are moments when the greatest struggle is not what is happening around you, but what is happening inside you. When your own thoughts become a battlefield. When questions start multiplying faster than answers. When faith feels divided between what you want to believe and what your mind keeps showing you. Doubts begin to rise. Problems begin to press in. And suddenly, life feels like a place where nothing is clear anymore. This message is for the moments when you are trying to believe, but your heart feels tired of trying to understand. When you are surrounded by situations you cannot fix and thoughts you cannot silence. When you still want to trust God, but you no longer know how to hold that trust inside confusion. Because what if God's love is not waiting for your doubts to disappear before He moves? What if He is opening a way precisely through them? Not only around you, but within you. What if the season of questions is not the collapse of your faith, but the place where a new way is being formed? This is not a message about having perfect faith. It is about discovering how God's love opens a way when doubt and problems arise. There is a moment when clarity does not disappear. It dissolves, not in noise, not in crisis, but in the quiet spaces where understanding used to live. What once felt solid begins to feel unstable. Thoughts that once formed quickly now hesitate. Answers that once brought peace no longer reach the heart. Prayer slows not because desire is gone, but because language no longer fits what is being felt. The soul enters a territory it did not choose, where certainty fades and presence becomes the only thing that remains. This is the true beginning of doubt, not rebellion, not rejection, but the collapse of inner structures that once organized faith. The internal maps that explained God, life, and self start to fail. The way you expected God to move no longer aligns with what you are living. The way you understood His timing no longer matches the days you are walking through. The spiritual logic that once gave coherence to everything begins to fracture. And when these inner maps break, the pain is not intellectual. It is existential. Because human beings do not live only by facts. They live by meaning, by orientation, by inner reference points that quietly tell the soul where it stands. When those reference points dissolve, confusion is not a flaw. It is the natural response of a soul that no longer knows how to locate itself. This is why doubt feels so unsettling. It is not only that answers are missing. It is that the place where answers used to stand is empty, and when that happens, everything else feels heavier. Problems that once would have been manageable suddenly carry more weight. Decisions feel riskier. Waiting feels longer. Even simple moments feel charged with uncertainty, because the inner world that once absorbed attention has lost its structure. The person is not only facing difficulties, they are facing them without the old internal ground. And in this state, the instinct is to repair clarity as quickly as possible, to force explanations, to borrow certainties, to cling to spiritual language even when it no longer feels alive, to rebuild the old map, because at least it is familiar. But God's love does not always restore what broke. Sometimes He allows it to dissolve fully, because what once guided you may not be able to guide what is coming, because the old way you related to Him may not be able to contain the depth He intends to reveal, because the old understanding of yourself may not be wide enough to hold who you are becoming. So God permits the inner clarity to collapse, not to leave you without direction, but to remove directions that no longer lead where He is opening a way. This is the sacred threshold of doubt, the place where faith is no longer supported by certainty, the place where believing is no longer reinforced by understanding, the place where the soul can no longer stand on ideas and must begin learning how to stand on relationship, on presence, on trust without definition. In this space, many people fear they are losing God, but often they are losing the version of God they were able to explain. And explanation is not the same as knowing, because knowing God does not always feel like clarity. Sometimes it feels like disorientation. Sometimes it feels like walking without the internal commentary. Sometimes it feels like staying present when the mind no longer knows what to say. This is not the end of faith. This is the edge of a deeper one. Because before God opens a way that can be seen, He often opens a way that must be walked without seeing. And the first step of that way is not confidence. It is the courage to remain, to keep breathing inside not knowing, to keep turning toward God without the old language, to keep living without the old map. And it is usually right here, in this fragile internal space, that something else begins to rise. Problems, complications, situations that press from multiple sides, not as punishment, but as confirmation that an old route has ended, and that a new one is being prepared. That is where the journey now moves. When doubt enters the inner world, problems often follow in the outer one, not always because life suddenly becomes cruel, but because the structures that once organized it are no longer functioning. What once absorbed tension no longer holds. What once gave direction no longer guides. And so everything that was already there begins to feel closer, louder, heavier. This is why problems rarely arrive alone in seasons of doubt. They cluster, they overlap, they seem to speak to one another. One situation weakens a place where another situation already felt fragile. One disappointment touches a fear that was already forming. One delay exposes a question that had long been buried. It feels as if life itself has decided to press every sensitive point at the same time. And this experience is deeply unsettling. Because the soul is not only dealing with difficulty, it is dealing with difficulty while the inner compass is breaking. This is where many people believe something has gone wrong. They assume the appearance of multiple problems means they are moving away from God. But often the opposite is true. Problems often arise together when an old way of moving is ending, when routines no longer fit the direction of the soul, when former supports are being removed, when God is disorganizing a path that can no longer carry what He is about to form. In these seasons, life begins to dismantle itself. Systems fail, expectations collapse, timelines dissolve, relationships shift, not randomly, but purposefully. Because before God opens a new way, He often interrupts the old one. He allows what no longer belongs to fall out of alignment. He permits the familiar to lose its authority. He creates friction between who you are becoming and what you have been living. This friction is not cruelty. It is separation. Separation between what sustained you before and what will sustain you next. The human heart often interprets this moment as punishment, as abandonment, as spiritual decline. But what if it is redirection? What if these overlapping problems are not obstacles to God's will, but signals that God's will is no longer located where it used to be? Because new ways rarely begin with comfort. They begin with disruption. They begin with the feeling that the ground no longer matches your feet. They begin with the unsettling sense that staying where you are is no longer possible. But moving forward is not yet clear. This is the tension of transition, and God's love is deeply present in it. He does not create chaos, but He allows old order to lose power. He does not destroy stability, but He removes what is falsely stabilizing. He does not overwhelm the soul, but He exposes what can no longer support it. Problems begin to surface because they were already there. They were simply being carried by structures that are now dissolving. When those structures weaken, everything they held becomes visible. And visibility is not the same as creation. It is revelation. God is not suddenly surrounding you with problems. He is allowing you to see where a new way is needed. This is the mercy hidden inside these moments. They make it impossible to continue unconsciously. They force attention. They awaken discernment. They call the soul out of automatic living. And this calling is uncomfortable, because awareness always feels heavier than habit. But awareness is the beginning of freedom, because once you can no longer walk the old way without pain, you are ready to learn a new one. And this is exactly where God's love is leading. Not toward immediate answers, but toward a deeper honesty, toward a clearer seeing, toward the truth of what is ending, and toward the birth of something that has not yet taken shape. But before a new way can be trusted, something else must be acknowledged. The grief hidden inside confusion. Because when old ways dissolve, something more than comfort is lost. A sense of identity. A story about how life works, an image of God, an understanding of self. And every real loss carries grief, even when it is necessary, even when it is sacred, even when it opens a door. This is the next layer of the journey, and it is one the soul must walk gently, because confusion is not only mental, it is emotional, and inside it, there is a quiet mourning that God's love never overlooks. Confusion is rarely empty. Beneath its noise lives something tender that is often overlooked. Grief. Not always the grief of what happened, but the grief of what no longer fits. The grief of losing the way things made sense. The grief of watching an inner world quietly dissolve. When doubts rise and problems begin to overlap, something deeper than stress often takes place. A subtle mourning. The heart is not only trying to solve, it is trying to let go. Let go of the image of God it carried. Let go of the version of faith that once felt natural. Let go of the story it told about how life unfolds. Let go of the expectations that once organized hope. And because these losses are internal, they are rarely named. There is no funeral for a belief that no longer holds. No ceremony for a certainty that no longer comforts. No public moment for a spiritual identity that quietly fades. So the grief remains hidden. It disguises itself as restlessness, as irritation, as mental fatigue, as emotional numbness, as the constant sense that something is wrong, even when nothing specific can be identified. This is why confusion often feels heavy, not because nothing is there, but because too much is there. Unspoken goodbyes, unfinished inner conversations. A past way of seeing that no longer returns. The soul is adjusting to the loss of a world it lived inside, and every true loss creates a destabilization before it creates space, because meaning is not easily replaced. When the structures that carried meaning dissolve, the heart enters a liminal place, a threshold, a between space, no longer where it was, not yet where it is going. This is the place many people try to escape. They rush to rebuild certainty. They borrow beliefs that do not belong to their experience. They silence questions that are asking to be honored. They force clarity before the soul has finished grieving. But God's love does not rush grief, because grief is not a problem to solve. It is a truth to walk through. It is the process by which the soul releases what can no longer carry it. God allows this hidden mourning because He is not only opening a new way, He is closing an old one. And every real closing touches the heart, even when it is right, even when it is necessary, even when it leads to life. So God's love moves gently here. He does not shame the sadness inside confusion. He does not rush the questions. He does not demand stability. He becomes presence within the disorientation. He holds the space where certainty once lived. He accompanies the heart while it learns to exist without the old inner supports. This is why some days feel heavier than they should. Because the soul is not only facing current problems, it is releasing former worlds. Worlds of belief, worlds of interpretation, worlds of expectation, worlds of self-understanding. And release always feels like loss before it feels like freedom. This grief also explains why doubt can feel emotional, not intellectual. Because it is not only the mind that is changing, it is the heart. It is not only theology that is being questioned, it is belonging. The soul is asking where it now stands, who it now is, how it now lives in relation to God. These are not small questions, they are identity questions. And identity transitions always carry mourning. God's love honors this. He does not treat confusion as failure. He treats it as a crossing, a passage, a sacred in-between where something true is ending and something true has not yet begun. And once this grief is acknowledged, something else often surfaces beneath it. Not only sadness, but vulnerability, a new exposure of the self. Because when old spiritual structures fall away, the soul no longer knows how to present itself. It no longer knows which parts to lead with, It no longer knows how to define itself in the same way. This is when doubt stops touching only understanding. It begins touching identity. And that is where the next movement of God's love unfolds. When doubt reaches identity, the experience changes. The question is no longer only what do I believe, but who am I now that what I believed no longer holds me the same way? The soul begins to feel exposed. The familiar spiritual clothing no longer fits. The language that once described you no longer feels true. The inner image you carried of yourself starts to dissolve. This is one of the most vulnerable moments of the journey. Because faith is not only something a person has, it is something a person lives inside. It shapes how you introduce yourself to life, how you pray, how you hope, how you interpret suffering, how you imagine your future. When that structure shifts, the self that was built within it must also change. So the soul enters a season of spiritual nakedness, not emptiness, exposure. The heart no longer hides behind roles, answers, or certainties. The mind no longer knows which identity to perform. The person may still believe in God, but they no longer know how to be who they were before. This can feel deeply unsettling, because identity offers more than description. It offers shelter. It tells the soul where it belongs. When doubt touches that shelter, the heart feels without covering, vulnerable to questions it once filtered, sensitive to experiences it once categorized, open in ways that feel both alive and frightening. This is why some people describe seasons of doubt as feeling spiritually unprotected. Old defenses fall, old spiritual reflexes weaken, old narratives lose their power, the self becomes available, and availability always feels risky. But this is not exposure without care. It is exposure with God. Because God's love is deeply present when identity is being touched. He does not enter the soul only when it is strong. He moves most intimately when it is undefended, because undefended places are where truth can be written. In this openness, God begins separating who you are from who you were taught to be. He loosens identities that were built around performance. He softens images that were shaped by fear. He dismantles roles that were sustained by control. He allows the soul to exist without immediate definition. This feels like loss, but it is also release. Because identities built on certainty often cannot survive trust. They need answers to breathe. They need structure to exist. They need control to feel safe. But God is leading the soul into an identity that can live in relationship, not explanation. Into a self that is not anchored in clarity, but in connection. This is the beginning of spiritual maturity, when the soul can exist before God without needing to present a finished version of itself. When faith is no longer something worn, it becomes something lived. And in this place, God does not rush to give the soul a new identity. He creates space. Because space is the womb of transformation. He allows silence. He allows suspension. He allows the self to rest without labels. This is not emptiness. It is possibility. It is the inner clearing where a new way can be planted. But before a new way appears, God often deepens this space. He widens it. He stills it. He quiets what would rush to fill it. Because the next movement of His love is not about showing the path. It is about creating the capacity to receive it. God opens space before He opens ways. He clears before He directs. He empties before He leads. And this inner emptying is not abandonment. It is preparation. Because what He is about to open cannot be carried by the old structures, and the soul is being readied to walk differently, to believe differently, to follow differently. And that preparation begins in the place where identity no longer clings, where the heart no longer defines itself by certainty, where the soul is quiet enough to sense a new movement. That is where the next chapter begins. Where God's love does not yet open a road, but opens space for one to be born. Before God opens a way, He often opens space. Space inside the mind where old explanations no longer rush to speak. Space inside the heart where former identities no longer demand to lead. Space inside the spirit where control loosens and listening begins. This space can feel uncomfortable, even frightening, because the human instinct is to fill emptiness quickly, to replace what dissolved, to rebuild certainty as soon as possible, to occupy the silence with conclusions, to settle the tension with answers. But God's love does not rush to fill what He is preparing. He protects the empty places. Because emptiness is not absence. It is capacity. It is the inner clearing where a new way can be planted. When doubt and problems arise together, the soul often feels suspended. Not held by what was, not yet supported by what will be. And this suspension can feel like instability, like floating without ground, like standing between breaths. Yet this suspended space is one of the most creative places in the spiritual life, because here, the soul is no longer governed by what it knows. It becomes receptive to what it has not yet lived. God begins to widen perception. He stretches the inner world so that it can hold new movements, new understandings, new ways of relating to Him. New ways of believing that are not built on emotional certainty or mental agreement, but on relational trust. This is why the space often feels quiet. God is not removing noise. He is removing interference. He is allowing the soul to hear again. Not voices, direction, not explanations, presence, not instruction, orientation. In this open space, the soul slowly relearns how to exist before God, not as a problem to be solved, not as a belief system to be defended, but as a living being to be guided. God's love begins to shift the internal posture from standing over life to standing within it, from analyzing every movement to sensing direction, from demanding clarity to learning attentiveness. This is the space where new faith is formed, not the faith of answers, the faith of following, not the faith of understanding, the faith of movement. Because God is not only opening a way in front of you, He is opening a way of being within you, a way of relating, a way of listening, a way of responding. And these ways cannot be taught, they must be grown. So God keeps the space open. He resists premature closure. He delays easy certainty. He allows the soul to rest without a framework. Because what is being formed is not a conclusion. It is a capacity. The capacity to sense God's lead without knowing the destination. The capacity to move without needing to control the map. The capacity to trust without needing emotional confirmation. This is the inner environment where the new way will emerge. Not as a sudden opening, but as a quiet orientation. Not as a dramatic sign, but as a gentle pull. Not as a loud instruction, but as a steady direction. And as this inner space becomes familiar, something else often surfaces. Anxiety. The anxiety of not knowing what to stand on. The tension of walking without reference. The unease of being led without clarity. This is not regression. It is the nervous system encountering a new form of faith. And that is where the next movement of God's love unfolds, where He does not remove uncertainty. He teaches the soul how to live within it, how to breathe inside it, how to walk upon it, because the new way God is opening does not always begin as a road. Sometimes it begins as water, and the soul must learn how to stand where it cannot yet see the ground. When the old supports fall away and the new way has not yet revealed its shape, the soul enters a strange terrain. It no longer knows what to stand on. Certainty has loosened. Familiar assurances no longer carry weight. And what remains is a feeling many people describe as floating, not falling, not standing. Floating. This is the anxiety of not knowing what holds. The mind reaches for concepts, but they slip. The heart searches for feelings, but they fluctuate. The body longs for stability, but the inner ground keeps shifting. Faith no longer feels like solid earth, it feels like movement. This is where many believe they are failing spiritually, because they were taught that faith feels firm, clear, certain. But there is another kind of faith, one that does not feel like ground. It feels like water. It does not stop the motion. It carries it. God's love introduces the soul to this new experience, not to remove uncertainty, but to teach the heart how to remain present within it. This is where the nervous system begins to react, because it was built to seek predictability, to build safety on patterns, to stabilize itself through what it can measure. So when predictability dissolves, the body experiences threat even when no danger is present. Thoughts speed up. The breath shortens. The urge to control intensifies. The soul tries to recreate the old ground, but God does not give it back. Because what is being formed cannot live on it. So God begins to work at the level of sensation, not belief, not logic. Sensation. He teaches the body how to remain without bracing. He teaches the heart how to feel movement without panic. He teaches the mind how to exist without immediate conclusions. This is where faith becomes embodied. No longer something the person thinks, something the person lives. The person begins to notice that even when nothing feels stable, they are still being carried. They still wake. They still breathe. They still move through days. They still respond to beauty. They still feel moments of peace without knowing why. This is God's love educating the nervous system, showing it that safety can exist without predictability, that support can exist without explanation, that being held does not require understanding how. This is a profound shift. Because once the body learns that it can exist without controlling the ground, fear loses one of its deepest roots. The soul no longer needs clarity to remain. It no longer needs answers to breathe. It no longer needs certainty to stay open. This does not remove anxiety entirely, but it changes its power. Anxiety becomes sensation, not authority. Feeling, not direction. Experience, not command. And this change creates a new internal freedom. The person begins to realize they can live inside not knowing. They can walk without mapping. They can exist without predicting. This is the faith of movement, of responsiveness, of trust without formulation. And as the soul becomes familiar with this new way of standing, something else begins to happen. The inner world becomes quieter, not empty, receptive. The person begins to notice subtle shifts, gentle impulses, small internal turns, the beginnings of orientation. God's love does not yet open a visible road, but he begins to open perception, the ability to sense direction. And once perception awakens, the way begins to form, not as a destination, as a movement. This is where the next chapter leads, into the first signs of a new way that does not appear outside but within. The first signs of a new way rarely arrive as solutions. They arrive as sensitivity, a subtle change in how the heart listens, a new awareness of inner movements, a gentler perception of what once felt only heavy. The soul begins to notice that even without answers, it is no longer closed. Something inside is awake, receptive, attentive in a way it was not before. The mind does not dominate every moment. The heart is no longer only reacting. There is space between what happens and what is felt. This is perception being restored. God's love opens this perception before he opens direction. Because a way is not only a road to walk, it is a way to see. The person begins to sense inner shifts that do not come from fear, quiet inclinations, gentle resistances, small inner permissions, movements that feel different from impulse, different from pressure, different from old habits of control. This is God teaching the soul how to recognize his guidance not through noise but through resonance, not through force, through alignment. There is a growing ability to feel when something settles and when something disturbs. When a thought carries peace and when it carries urgency. When an idea expands the inner world and when it contracts it. These sensations become subtle markers, guiding the heart without explanation. This is how God's love begins opening the new way. He trains the soul to sense before it sees, to listen before it understands, to respond before it can define. This sensitivity is not emotional instability. It is spiritual awakening. The heart is learning a new language, A language not built from certainty but from attunement, not from control but from contact. The person may not yet know where they are going, but they begin to know when they are being led. And this knowing does not feel dramatic. It feels quiet. It shows itself in small decisions that suddenly feel clear, in conversations that take unexpected turns, in moments of restraint where impulse once ruled, in attractions toward things that carry peace rather than intensity. God's love is shaping discernment, not the discernment of rules, the discernment of life. The soul starts to sense where life flows and where it tightens, where truth resonates and where it strains, where presence deepens and where fear speaks. This is the new internal compass forming. It does not point to destinations. It points to direction, and direction is enough to begin. Because God rarely reveals the entire path. He reveals the next movement, the next turn, the next inner yes, the next gentle no. This is why the way first appears inside, before it ever becomes visible outside. Because the way God opens is not only something you walk into, it is something you walk as. A new quality of being, a new manner of responding, a new way of relating to life and to Him. And as this perception becomes clearer, something else begins to change, the mind itself. God's love now moves into the way thoughts are formed, how interpretations arise, how meaning is assigned. He begins redirecting the architecture of the inner world, because perception without renewed thinking would still collapse under old patterns. So the next movement of His work is not around circumstances, it is around consciousness, around the way reality is processed, around the way the soul understands what it encounters. This is where the new way deepens, where God does not only open a path, He changes how the path is seen. And this is where the next chapter leads. As perception awakens, the mind does not remain the same. God's love begins to touch the place where meaning is created, the patterns that once interpreted every experience, the reflexes that quickly decided what something meant, the internal conclusions that formed before awareness could even arrive. Because the way a person thinks is not neutral. It is shaped. It is trained. It carries history, emotion, survival, and belief. And when doubt and problems arise, these patterns often tighten. The mind looks for certainty. It rushes to define. It organizes experience through fear or control. It searches for explanations that can restore a sense of command. But God is opening a different way. Not a way to think faster, a way to think truer. He begins loosening the automatic inner commentary, the constant labeling, the reflex to interpret everything through threat or loss or failure. He interrupts the mental habits that narrow reality and replace them with habits that can hold complexity. The mind starts to slow, not into emptiness, into depth. Thoughts become less reactive and more reflective. Questions become invitations rather than problems. Silence becomes space rather than absence. The person begins to notice not only what they think, but how they think. This is a profound shift, because the mind no longer stands above life trying to dominate it. It begins to stand within life, listening to it. God's love redirects the mental architecture from control to communion, from certainty to curiosity, from prediction to presence. This does not mean clarity disappears. It means clarity is no longer forced. It forms. The person may still face problems, but they are no longer immediately framed as threats. They are experienced as movements, signals, conversations life is having with the soul. The mind begins to ask different questions. Not how do I stop this, but what is this shaping? Not why is this happening, but where is this leading? Not what does this say about me, but what is being invited? These questions do not remove difficulty. They change relationship, and relationship changes everything. Because when the mind is no longer fighting reality, the heart becomes available to guidance. This redirection of thinking also dissolves the need to constantly explain God. The soul becomes comfortable with mystery, not as avoidance, as reverence. It allows God to remain larger than understanding, present without being contained, near without being defined. This is where belief becomes living, not agreement, movement, orientation, participation. The mind stops demanding to see the whole road. It learns to walk the one step it consents. And once this new mental posture forms, another truth becomes clear. The way God is opening is not a place. It is a direction, not a destination to reach. A manner of moving, a way of responding, a way of following. Because God is not leading the soul into a static answer. He is leading it into a living process. And this realization carries the heart into the next chapter, where the way is no longer expected to appear as an outcome, but recognized as an unfolding, a path that reveals itself only through movement, a guidance that becomes visible only through following. This is where God's love invites the soul next. Not to understand where it is going, but to begin walking how it is being led. The way God opens rarely announces itself as a destination. It does not appear with a name, a map, or a final picture. It appears as a direction, a gentle inner orientation, a subtle sense of where life is moving, even when the mind cannot yet describe it. This is often surprising to the soul, because many people are waiting for God to show them where they are going. But God is first teaching them how to go, how to move, how to respond, how to follow. The new way is not first a place. It is a posture. It is the slow reorientation of the heart toward life rather than away from it, toward God rather than toward explanations, toward movement rather than toward certainty. The person begins to feel drawn rather than driven, prompted rather than pressured, led rather than pushed. This direction may express itself in small, almost unremarkable ways. A quiet sense to pause, a gentle impulse to reach out, a subtle resistance to something that once felt necessary, a new openness where there was once avoidance. None of this feels like a grand solution. It feels like alignment. And alignment is how God builds roads. Because roads are not made all at once. They are traced, step by step, through repeated movement in the same orientation. God's love is teaching the soul to recognize direction not by intensity, but by consistency, not by emotion, but by coherence, not by urgency, but by peace. The new way often feels simpler than expected, less dramatic, more faithful. It does not promise escape. It invites participation. It does not eliminate problems. It changes how the soul walks among them. This is why God often withholds the full picture, because the full picture would keep the soul standing still, evaluating. But direction invites motion, and motion is where the way forms. The person begins to notice that when they follow these gentle internal leadings, something shifts. Not always outside, but inside. The inner world feels less divided. The heart feels less scattered. The mind feels less at war with itself. This coherence is the sign of the new way. Because God's paths do not always remove complexity. They bring integration. They do not always solve life. They teach the soul how to live within it without losing itself. This direction also teaches the soul how to trust differently. Trust no longer means believing a certain outcome will happen. It means remaining responsive to guidance. It means staying open to movement. It means allowing God to lead one step at a time without demanding to possess the whole journey. This is where belief becomes relational. The soul is no longer believing in an idea about God. It is responding to God, listening, turning, following. And this kind of belief does not need certainty to survive. It is sustained by contact, by presence, by the quiet experience of being led. And as the soul becomes familiar with this way of moving, something else begins to emerge. A sense that this guidance did not begin now. That even in the deepest confusion, something was already arranging the path, already redirecting, already protecting, already building a road the eyes could not yet see. This awareness carries the heart into the next layer of the journey. where God's love reveals that the way did not start when clarity returned. It started long before, in the unseen. In moments that once felt like interruption, in paths that once felt like detours, in problems that once felt like obstacles. This is where the invisible road God has been building begins to come into view. And that is where the next chapter leads. Long before the soul sensed direction, God was already arranging movement. Long before clarity softened, paths were being prepared. Long before the heart felt led, the way was being built. This is one of the most humbling realizations of the spiritual life. God's love does not begin working when we become aware. It has been working. There are moments you once labeled as interruptions that were actually redirections. Conversations that felt random that were quietly shaping future doors. Delays that felt unnecessary that were protecting unseen alignments. Problems that seemed only to block that were repositioning the soul for something it could not yet receive. God has been constructing an invisible road, not in abstraction, in reality, through people, through timing, through experiences, through inner transformations, through closed paths, through opened questions, through unresolved seasons. Every doubt that unsettled the old way made space for a new one. Every problem that complicated life exposed a place where a different route was needed. Every confusion loosened a structure that could not support what was coming. The soul often looks back and realizes that many of the moments it feared most were the ones that prevented it from walking into something smaller than what God intended. This is the mercy of God's hidden work. He does not only open doors, He blocks exits that would lead to constriction. He does not only give, He withholds what would have shaped the future in ways that harm. He does not only lead forward, He redirects sideways, backward, inward, because the way He opens is not a straight line. It is a formation. God's love weaves experiences that seem unrelated into a single preparation. He uses inner shifts to prepare outer encounters. He uses outer complications to deepen inner listening. He synchronizes the unseen with the seen so that when the way appears, the soul is already walking it. This is why the new way often feels strangely familiar. Not because it is predictable, but because something inside already knows it. It resonates. It carries recognition. It feels less like discovery and more like arrival into something that was forming all along. God's love creates this recognition by working in layers. He arranges what the eyes will later enter. He develops what the heart will later hold. He restructures what the mind will later understand. So when the path begins to emerge, it does not feel foreign. It feels right, not easy, but right. And this sense of rightness is not emotional comfort. It is spiritual coherence. It is the alignment between what God has been forming within and what He has been preparing beyond. This realization also softens regret, because the soul begins to see that many of the turns it judged harshly were not mistakes. They were materials. They were shaping elements. They were movements within a construction the soul did not yet know was happening. God's love redeems the memory of the journey, not by changing the facts, by revealing the meaning. And as this meaning becomes visible, something else changes. The soul no longer relates to the past as a series of failures. It begins to relate to it as a path, a road that was being laid under the feet, even when the eyes could not see it. This perspective opens a new depth of trust, because the soul realizes that God did not wait for faith to become strong before He acted. He acted so that faith could be born again, and this awareness prepares the heart for the next movement. Where belief is no longer something the soul tries to hold, it becomes something the soul lives. Where trust is no longer a conclusion, it becomes a posture, because now the heart can begin to believe in a way it never could before, not in what it can see, but in what it has already experienced without knowing it. This is where God's love carries the soul next, into a form of belief that does not depend on emotional certainty, but on relational reality. And that is where the next chapter unfolds. Belief changes when it no longer depends on certainty. It deepens. It quiets. It moves from the surface of thought into the core of relationship. The soul stops asking, "Do I understand?" and begins living from a different question. Am I being led? This is where God's love brings the heart, when doubts and problems have done their sacred work. Belief is no longer an emotional state. It is an orientation, a posture of responsiveness, a way of standing inside life that does not require constant reassurance to remain open. The soul begins to believe not because everything feels clear, but because it has discovered something more stable than clarity. Presence. The presence that did not leave when answers collapsed. The presence that remained when prayer changed its tone. The presence that carried the heart through confusion, grief, exposure, and rebuilding. This presence becomes the new ground, not an idea about God, but an experience of God. And this experience reshapes belief at its root, because belief is no longer about holding a conclusion. It is about living in contact. The heart learns that it can move forward without possessing the future. It can trust without rehearsing outcomes. It can remain open without managing God. This belief does not speak loudly. It moves quietly. It does not defend itself. It expresses itself through attention, humility, and availability. The soul begins to live in a listening mode, not passive, attentive, not waiting for proof, responsive to guidance, not asking God to explain every step, willing to walk the one being given. This is where belief becomes embodied. It enters choices. It shapes timing. It influences tone. It directs energy. The person notices they are no longer driven by the same urgencies. They are not controlled by the same fears. They are not anchored in the same need to resolve everything before moving. They can live inside process. They can remain in dialogue with uncertainty. They can walk with God rather than ahead of Him. This is not spiritual weakness. It is spiritual maturity, because maturity is not measured by how many answers a person carries. It is revealed by how deeply a person can trust while carrying none. God's love forms this maturity not by removing problems, but by changing what problems touch. They no longer reach the center. They no longer define identity. They no longer govern direction. They become experiences within a larger relationship. And within that relationship, belief breathes naturally. It does not strain. It does not perform. It does not rush. It rests while it moves. It listens while it acts. It hopes without demanding. This is the belief God has been opening a way for, not the belief that tries to force light into darkness, the belief that walks with God through it. And as this belief settles, another realization gently arises, that the soul was never lost. It was being led, even when it felt like it was wandering, even when it felt like it was failing, even when it felt like it was standing still. God's love was guiding beneath awareness, opening paths that could not yet be named, redirecting steps that could not yet be understood. This realization brings the heart to the edge of the journey, where the story of doubt and problems is no longer read as evidence of distance, but as the very way God was opening. And that is where the next chapter carries the soul, into the truth that nothing here was wasted, nothing here was random, nothing here was without God. Because the way was never absent, it was forming, and now it is ready to be recognized. There is a quiet moment when the inner tension releases, not because everything has been solved, but because something has been understood without words. The soul realizes it has not been drifting, it has been moving. The confusion did not mean absence. The doubt did not mean separation. The problems did not mean obstruction. They meant transition. And with that realization, an inner light begins to return. Not excitement, clarity, not certainty, orientation. The pressure to define everything softens. The urgency to resolve everything loosens. The heart is no longer fighting the season. It is listening to it. This is the return of inner light, not the light that shows the whole road, the light that shows the next step. The person begins to sense God again, not as an idea to hold, but as a presence that guides, in the way decisions begin to settle, in the way some paths lose attraction, in the way certain thoughts no longer carry power, in the way silence stops feeling empty and begins to feel inhabited. The inner world grows calmer, not because there are fewer problems, but because there is less division. The heart is no longer split between believing and resisting, between hoping and protecting, between trusting and controlling. A quiet coherence forms, and this coherence brings a new kind of peace. Not the peace that depends on answers, the peace that comes from being accompanied. The person realizes they are no longer trying to force their way through doubt. They are allowing God to lead them through it. They are no longer measuring faith by how strong they feel. They are recognizing faith by how gently they are being guided. This inner light reveals something important. God did not wait for confusion to end before he came near. He was near inside it. And that nearness has been shaping perception, softening resistance, rebuilding trust, and opening the way from within. So the soul stops searching for God ahead. It begins to notice God here, in the present step, in the current breath, in the unfolding moment. And this recognition prepares the heart for the final movement of the journey. Because once the soul sees that God has been leading all along, the entire story changes. Doubt is no longer an enemy. Problems are no longer only obstacles. Confusion is no longer a failure. They become the language God used to open the way. And this truth carries the heart into its final understanding. You were never lost. You were being led. Even when you could not recognize the direction, even when you did not understand the process, even when nothing made sense. The doubts were not signs of separation. They were signs of invitation. The problems were not proof of distance. They were movements of redirection. The confusion was not the collapse of faith. It was the doorway to a deeper one. God's love has been opening a way not by removing every question, but by teaching the soul how to walk without needing to answer them first. He has been guiding you out of old forms of believing and into living relationship, out of certainty and into trust, out of control and into communion. And now the heart can look back and recognize the pattern, how one difficulty interrupted a direction that no longer served, how one doubt dissolved an understanding that had grown too small, how one problem created a turning the soul would never have chosen but desperately needed. This was not chaos, it was choreography, not random, relational, not abandonment, leading. God has been opening a way through every disruption, every question, every unresolved moment. He has been walking ahead and within at the same time, and now the soul stands in a different place. Not because everything is clear, but because everything is held inside presence, held inside purpose, held inside love. And this is where the journey settles, not in explanation, in trust. Because what God opens with his love does not close when doubt appears, it opens through it. And now, the heart is ready to seal this truth not only in reflection, but in Scripture. As it says in Proverbs 3:5-6, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." You were never asked to understand the way, only to walk it with him. And even when doubts rose, even when problems pressed, even when confusion surrounded you, God's love did not pause. It guided. It redirected. It prepared. It opened. So if today your heart still feels uncertain, let this truth remain. You are not standing in a closed place. You are standing in a place where God's love is opening a way, not only before you, but within you. And that way is still unfolding.